Welcome back to Pop Flashback. I'm your host, Rick Smalls. Tina Boucher is on assignment at the mall, so it's just you and me today. Today we're heading back to the 60s, the era of Beatlemania bell-bottoms, and believe it or not, Beatles cartoons. That's right, we're taking a look at the Beatles cartoon.
Ah, Saturday morning classic. You know, for a lot of kids back then, this was their first introduction to the Fab Four.
It's crazy to think about, right? This show was on for 2 seasons, from 65 to 67 on ABC, and then it got a whole second life in syndication. It even showed up on MTV and the Disney Channel in the 80s and 90s.
It's amazing how this cartoon captured that early Beatles NSA, even though the band wasn't really involved in making it.
I know. It was their music that was the main attraction. Each episode was actually named after a Beatles song, like A Hard Day's Night or Help.
And speaking of Help, can you imagine seeing real people animated on a weekly TV show for the very first time? That was groundbreaking back in '65.
Totally. And they didn't hold back on the animation either. We're talking fast cuts, bold colors, lots of slapstick humor.
Slapstick was perfect for the Beatles in cartoon form. It amplified all their movements and their reactions, turning John's sarcasm, Paul's charm, George's dry humor, and Ringo's goofy energy up to 11.
Oh, absolutely. It's like they took their personalities and made them super cartoony, which, sometimes meant being chased by vampires in Transylvania or outsmarting a jewel thief in Japan.
Those crazy adventures they had, loosely based on the songs, were total escapism. But it's really clever how the show got the feel of each song.
Talking about clever, we got to mention the voice actors. Paul Frees, a legend, did the voices for John and George, while Lance Percival did Paul and Ringo.
They did such a good job. They got those Liverpudlian accents and each Beatles personality down pat. And what's interesting is that the opening credits and theme song changed with each season to reflect the band's sound as it changed.
You're right. The first season had Can't Buy Me Love, the second Help, and the third used And Your Bird Can Sing. It was like a musical journey alongside the cartoon one.
And visually, the cartoon was all about that early Beatlemania era with the mop tops and sharp suits. Even when the real Beatles were changing their music and style, the cartoons stuck with that iconic look.
It's funny, though, because the band didn't love the cartoon at first, but they seemed to come around to it over time. George Harrison even said that the episodes were so bad or silly that they were good.
I think there's something charming about that. The show was lighthearted, all about fun, music, and adventure. And that resonated with people then and now.
That's true. There's a timeless quality to those Beatles tunes and that crazy energy the cartoon had.
It makes me wonder, for those of you who grew up watching the Beatles cartoon, did those animated adventures shape how you saw the band? It's wild how these cartoons, even though they were made for kids, still captured some of what made the Beatles so cool.
Yeah, you're right. It wasn't just the music or the doofy stuff. The show actually did a good job showing off each of their personalities, even if it was amped up for a cartoon.
Exactly. You always saw John's quick wit and how he was the leader, and they really made Paul the charmer. Remember how he would always be the one to smooth things over whenever, John and George were arguing?
Oh, yeah. Every episode had its own mini-band drama, which, let's face it, that's part of what makes the Beatles, even in real life.
Absolutely. And don't forget George. He's often seen as the quiet one, but he always had that dry sense of humor. And then you've got Ringo.
Our lovable Ringo, who was always getting into trouble. He almost always caused some crazy and hilarious situation.
It's funny how the show used those tropes. They knew what made each Beatle special, and they made it even bigger for laughs.
And while we're talking about making things bigger, we have to talk about those little bumpers or skits after each episode. Especially in that first season where they had those little 5-part stories, a tiny cliffhanger right before the commercial break.
Oh, yeah, those were great. Remember that one where George and Ringo find a huge pearl in a tree? It didn't make much sense, but it was so fun.
Or how about that one where Ringo is sleepwalking and it causes all sorts of problems? Those little skits really showed how creative the animators were.
And here's a fun fact. Those skits were actually animated in Mexico City. Adds a bit of international flavor, don't you think?
Definitely. It goes to show how much care went into these cartoons, which may seem simple on the surface. They weren't just making stuff for the sake of it. There was real artistry involved.
Right. And they weren't afraid to poke a little fun at themselves either. Remember that episode where the Beatles picture themselves as the Three Musketeers +1 when they're visiting a museum in France?
Oh, that's a classic. A fun little nod to how famous they were and how they were often seen as these larger-than-life figures.
Exactly. Or what about when they end up at a Roman street festival and Paul wins a dancing bear named Bonnie? That's totally a reference to being for the benefit of Mr. Kite.
It's those little details and references that make the show show so fun to watch even now. So the animators were having fun and winking at the audience who knew the real Beatles.
And since we're talking about fun, let's talk about the animation itself. It might look a bit old now, but there's a charm to those bright colors, fast cuts, and that classic 60s style.
Yeah, it definitely shows it's from another time. But it holds up pretty well. There's a certain energy and excitement that you don't always find in the animation they make today.
It's interesting to think about how these episodes with the music, adventure, and humor introduced the Beatles to a whole new group of people. Kids who maybe were too young for Beatlemania got a taste of it through these cartoons.
And for those of us who watched it back then, it's a total nostalgia trip. It brings you right back to those Saturday mornings spent watching TV.
It reminds you of a time when cartoons were simpler maybe, but they still had an impact. And of course it shows how strong the Beatles' music is.
Totally. Even in their simple animated form, John, Paul, George, and Ringo still managed to win over audiences.
You know, it makes me think, what if the Beatles cartoon was made today? What would it look like? Would their music and personalities work in a modern style of animation?
Now, that's a good question. I mean, would they still have those mop tops and suits, or would they have a more modern look?
It's fun to think about, isn't it? Would they be going through virtual worlds, or maybe even traveling through time to different periods in music?
Oh, a time-traveling Beatles cartoon. I love that idea. They could be jamming with Mozart in one episode and then rocking out with Jimi Hendrix in the next.
The possibilities are endless. But no matter the style or where they are, the show would still be about their music and those personalities we all know and love.
Exactly. And I bet their songs would sound amazing with all the technology they use today to make music.
You got it. Just imagine She Loves You with a dubstep beat or Strawberry Fields Forever as some crazy EDM track. Now that would be wild.
It would be wild in a good way, though. You know what else I think a modern Beatles cartoon could do? They could show what they did after the band broke up.
That's an interesting idea. It could go into their solo careers, their lives, maybe even their activism. That would be a whole new side to the Beatles that the old cartoon couldn't have done.
Totally. It would introduce a whole new generation to John, Paul, George, and Ringo, not just as a band, but as individuals, too.
It's really something how this simple cartoon from the 60s still makes people talk today.
It shows just how much the Beatles meant to the world, doesn't it? Their music, their personalities, their impact on culture.
Absolutely. It's a legacy that keeps going for generations, and it keeps inspiring people and making them happy. And who knows, maybe someday we'll get that modern Beatles cartoon. We can always hope, right?
Keep dreaming. But, you know, even if that never happens, we can always go back and watch those old episodes. A little bit of cartoon Beatlemania always makes things better.
And since you mentioned making things better, did you ever catch the Beatles cartoon back in the day? What was your favorite crazy adventure? Let us know in the comments.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch our next episode. Smalls out.
Thank you.